recent days we've seen reports in the media of Gauteng Provincial Government's 20 billion rand bill towards the outstanding SANRAL debts, debt incurred on the infamous e-tolls project in the province to toll the major highways. The question I ask myself is, could this project, this e-tolling project, have worked in a different environment if it had been done in a different way? And actually I think potentially it could have, and potentially it could have even been a useful project. It could have had a lot of good. And the principle of the user pays is not necessarily an unacceptable one across the world. Let's think about it. I think many taxpayers, including myself, would find appeal in the idea that my taxes don't necessarily have to fund everything. Maybe the users of that facility should pay charges for it instead, and it not be funded by my taxes. I think that principle has appeal. So let the users pay and the non-users not pay, instead of non-users often paying through their tax bill. But the first fundamental problem with this was that taxpayers had already footed the bill for the establishment of these highways years before, and the upgrades of the highways too had been completed in time for the 2010 World Cup, and they were all state-of-the-art, the ring roads, the various roads around Gauteng. And then after that you come with e-tolls, and many taxpayers were saying, hang on a moment, now you want me to pay to use this highway after my taxes have already funded the highway. And that was not found to be acceptable amongst many. That's the first problem. The second principle, I think, is if taxpayers are to support such moves towards greater user pay charges, use of user pays charges, is that, okay, so my tax money is not footing the bill for this anymore, so where are the tax cuts? That was not forthcoming either. These e-tolls arrived, the timing wasn't particularly good. They arrived at a time when taxpayers were seeing their effective tax rates in many cases rise. Rates and tariffs bills, electricity bills, etc., at local government and state-owned enterprise level were already rising in excess of inflation. And in many cases, the services for what we were paying were deteriorating. Service delivery was deteriorating. So taxpayers and ratepayers and utilities bills payers felt that they were paying more for less, and often had to incur additional funding overall to find solutions for the lack of service delivery. If we think of the crime problem in South Africa and how much extra people have forked out for armed response and various security installations in their homes, the costs have been quite significant. So that's the environment in which this e-tolls suddenly arrived. Without tax cuts and feeling like we're paying more for less, that's not a conducive environment to gaining the support of people for the user pays principle. The user pays principle can also be used advantageously to change behavior in the right way, potentially. If we look at London's congestion charge, it's a whole zone, and if you go into that zone with your private vehicle, you are e-tolled effectively. There's an e-toll charge, congestion charge they call it, to try and limit the use of private vehicles in that central zone of London. This is potentially, this seems to have had some good in London in reducing congestion, reducing private vehicle use, and probably reducing greenhouse gas emissions pollution as well, and increasing public transport use and active transport use. Now this is, to me, a desirable shift, and it could have been potentially utilized for that purpose in Gauteng as well. But there's two shortcomings here with the e-tolls project as it was applied. Firstly, it was only applied to the highways. So if anything, it may have incentivized less private vehicle use, but more likely, if people didn't like the e-tolls, paying the e-tolls, it might have incentivized alternate route use onto alternate routes funded by ratepayers or taxpayers and not by e-toll users. In other words, free route supposedly for the user. So it could have conceivably just led to increased congestion and increased deterioration of alternate routes, and that wouldn't necessarily be promoting that cause that I've mentioned. Secondly, if it's to incentivize greater use of public transport and active transport, immediately, and I think correctly, the e-toll payers would have said, but hang on a moment, where is the acceptable public transport? There is a Gautrain on one route, that is true, which is state of the art, but that's about it in Gauteng. In other parts of the city, public transport really isn't yet up to standard. So to make it work, you would have that strategy work, you would have had to develop good public transport in tandem with the implementation of a user pays principle, and that would be that's quite a process. That's quite a holistic strategy. It probably goes further. I think it's besides the what I've mentioned already, that it came at bad timing. I think that Gauteng road users were also looking at this e-tolls arriving and saying, but why us? We're the only place in the country that's going to have e-tolls. Nowhere else is having it, or yet anyway. And this just seems rather unfair, especially given that the Gauteng province generates the biggest single portion of South Africa's tax base. So it's funding a lot of infrastructure in the country already. It's funded these highways which are to be e-tolled, and now we are the only ones in the country going to pay e-tolls. So I think that it possibly wasn't the principle of user pays that was flawed, but the implementation of such charges requires a lot of thought and a far more holistic transport strategy and taxation strategy to appease the people who are going to have to shift to paying these charges.